Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The war on Iran is sending shockwaves through the global economy, but nowhere are the effects more immediate and more severe than in Asia. Across the region, governments are scrambling to secure supplies, while businesses and households face rising costs. In some countries, shortages are already triggering panic buying and even social unrest. What we are seeing is not just a temporary crisis. It could reshape growth, inflation, and even long-term energy strategies across Asia. So how vulnerable are Asian economies to this shock? Who will be hit the hardest and who might adapt? And could this crisis accelerate a deeper transformation in Asia's economic model? Join us for discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, joining me today are Zhao Hai, Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy, Professor Anna Rosario Malindog-Uy, Director and Vice President for External Affairs at the Asian Century Philippines Strategic Studies Institute, and Professor Robert Kelly from the Department of Political Science at Pusan National University. Welcome to the show. So I will start with Anna. Anna, when we talk about the impact on Asian countries, Asian economies, first we think of is the Philippines. It is the first country to declare energy emergency state. So how is the situation now?
Thank you so much for that question. I think this is very important and relevant given the current situation in Asia. Before I go on to the Philippines, let me give you a context of what is going on in Asia at the moment. As you can see, Asia is already in an energy crisis, economically and strategically speaking. So when you talk about energy crisis, basically we're talking about price shocks, supply risk, and policy stress due to heavy dependence on Strait of Hormuz. Because if you look at Asian economies, they're very much import dependent of oil in the Middle East. So basically you have inflation now, weaker currency, slower growth, and governments are actually forced into subsidies, reserves, release, and emergency measure. And if you look at observable impacts of the current Middle East war, across Asia, including my country, you can see that there are what you call rising of fuel and transportation costs, inflation of food and basic commodities, because when prices of oil rises, of course, all commodities, including transportation, would rise up. Market volatility and currency pressure in the Philippines right now, if you look at our currency, it's already like $1 to 61 roughly. If you how do you call that? It's around, it's 61 roughly to a dollar, which is historically the deterioration of our currency is quite amazingly dangerous to a certain extent. And you have also, and the Philippines actually is crumbling in the same manner that other Asian economies are crumbling for sources of oil and other energy-related products. But given this context in Asia, it is my country, the Philippines, that has declared national emergency. Precisely because my country is import dependent, around 100%, I think. We import oil from the Middle East, or 90% to that extent. So we have limited reserves, weeks. Well, of course, the Marcos government is saying that we're okay, but actually in reality, we are already in a crunch time, and also we're using emergency fund. And of course, our Department of Foreign Affairs are trying to have this diplomacy with Iran so that we can have access to the Strait of Hormuz. So basically, we have this kind of situation. And of course, the Filipino people are suffering from inflation, price hike, and all commodities are rising. So it's not necessarily easy for us at the moment. And also there is such a thing as alignment, because as you can see, the Philippines is a military ally of the United States. We have the mutual treaty, and of course Iran would not be very friendly to any allies of the United States, given that this Middle East crisis is caused by the unchallenged attack. The first to attack Iran is actually the United States alongside Israel. So that's
That is true.
basically our situation in the Philippines at the moment.
Right, right. And no wonder many people are not happy with that because the situation is not improving at all. Robert, I know the situation in South Korea, is it any better than, say, in the Philippines or other, I know like in countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, higher institution, education institution, they were closed even to save energy. What about the situation in South Korea?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I've heard of any closures yet. Certainly, in where I live in the city, you don't see that yet. But South Korea does have a strategic petroleum reserve. I can't speak to other countries, but I know that South Korea has that, and there have been releases from that. There's also very good public transportation here. There's electric buses and a lot of electronic cars and stuff like that. So I think there's a little bit more room to sort of buffer the shocks here. South Korea is also, its cities are quite dense, and so people can walk to work, right? Because much of the country is mountainous, and so you have a lot of clustering, and so that makes in other words, there are options to carbon. But yes, the larger point is yes, that there is a sort of energy crunch on the horizon. The president has spoken to that. He said that it's kept him up at night and stuff like that. My wife drives a great deal for work. She's talking about how gas is more expensive. My colleagues at work have said the same thing. I don't think it's quite as acute as your Filipino guest was saying, but I do think that if the strait doesn't open in the next 6 weeks or so, there's going to start to be, if not shortages, there will be substantial price hikes.
Right, and no wonder the president of South Korea is saying something like, he has some sleepless night. Zhao Hai, Asia is the world's largest energy importing region. About 84% of oil and LNG shipped through the Strait of Hormuz goes to Asia. Of course, big economies, China, Japan, India, of course, they consume a lot of energy. How would you characterize the situation in China?
Well, first of all, let me say this. This is an uncharted territory we're entering into because last time when we had this kind of crisis coming out of the Middle East, East Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, is not industrialized to the extent that they're heavily dependent upon oil and gas, particularly natural gas from the Strait of Hormuz. And now we are very much consuming a large portion of the Middle East oil and gas. So we're very much dependent upon the openness of the Strait of Hormuz. Compared to our colleagues in the Philippines and also in South Korea, China's position is a little bit better because China has been preparing for this contingency because China's worried about is energy security. We're also importing a large portion of oil and gas around the world. However, China is much more diversified. We have many sources from Central Asia, from Russia, from other part of the world, Australia, Latin America, and also Africa. But again, this is a problem of a short-term versus long-term, because in the short term, as our previous guest pointed out, that we have released, reserves from IEA, and also particularly within China. China also stopped exporting some of the oil products. At the same time, I think the price of gasoline also rise in China, but compared to other countries, is relatively moderate. However, in the long run, we're also facing this severe problem of an overall shortage in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, because of the danger of running out of the reserves. And also many industries, not just transportation, needs materials that is based upon petrol. So I think as long as this war continued, we will have this crisis over the horizon that is much worse than the current situation.
That's right. You mentioned about products beyond oil and gas, petrochemical inputs products, and helium. Robert, helium is an essential product for cheap manufacturing. Then people would think of Japan, would think of South Korea, the Chinese, Taiwan, etc. Do people expect the production of chips will be affected in some way?
Excuse me. I think so. I think there's sort of particularly here in South Korea, I think there's a sort of a long-term concern that the cutoff of petroleum and plastics from the Gulf will sort of impact industrial production. There's a great deal of concern about imports, I think, as well from Taiwan, because, of course, South Korea produces a great deal of phones and sort of other modern electronics, all of which require these fairly elaborate supply chains. You know, I mean, a month ago, who knew anything about helium coming out of the Persian Gulf, right? I mean, people just didn't even know what that was, right? And here we are. And I think this really illustrates that the world economy actually has a great deal of choke points, because we now live in a world where you have supply chains that are deeply globalized with a lot of intermediate trade as well, not just finished trade. And so there are a lot of like break points and failure points in global supply chains I think we don't really know about. And you really saw that here, I think, in the Persian Gulf, where everybody thought at first it would be higher gas prices, and then it turned out to be things like fertilizer and helium, which again, you know, I mean, 6 weeks ago, who knew about fertilizer from the Persian Gulf? And so yes, I think the medium-term answer to your question is that in places like South Korea and Taiwan, again, if you don't get this back online, there are going to be substantial disruptions. They're probably going to take a year or so to adapt to if, again, if the strait doesn't open.
Exactly. We have reports of, the production of basic medical supplies, even like syringes and gloves in South Korea, Japan, being affected there. So, Anna, speak of how to cope with such a emergency situation. You earlier mentioned about the U.S. allies. I know some of the Asian countries, they talk to the Iranian side, for example. I think Indonesia and also Philippine foreign minister, they also had a very good conversation there. Hopefully, vessels will be, navigate safely out of the Strait of Hormuz there. I'm not sure whether you are observing like countries like Japan, like South Korea, the close allies of the U.S., even with the lifting of sanctions on Russian oil and gas, on Iranian oil and gas, are they purchasing, gas from oil from Russia, or is it comfortable for them to do so? Or what about the Philippines? Is Philippines allowed to purchase oil from Russia, for example?
Actually, that's a very interesting question, because it was Trump who actually announced. I mean, Trump's government announced that they suspend what you call embargo on Russian oil or Russian energy related products. So it seems that they allow their allies to to have transaction with Russia. In as far as my country is concerned, I think we had just Russian oil tanker just delivered to the Philippines a supply, but I think it was purchased by a oil corporation, Petron. So it's not necessarily the government, but actually it was, well, I would assume that the current administration would have something to do with that. So in a way, there is this kind of what you call U.S. allies are trying to make some negotiation with so-called U.S. adversaries like Russia and even with Iran, because our Department of Foreign Affairs Secretary just had talks with Iran saying that, don't consider the Philippines as a hostile country, despite the fact that we have the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States, and we're also lobbying right now with Iran that, any kind of oil tanker that is there that would be directed to the Philippines to supply us with energy related products, and we're asking Iran, to let it pass, and so that we will have some supply. So I think there is a trend right now that, when you talk about energy issue, especially what's going on in the Middle East, it's not necessarily only about economics. It's not about oil trade. It's more about now geopolitical in terms of alignment. And you can see that even though there is such a thing as a U.S. ally, when it comes to crunch time, when it comes to national survival, that is being set aside precisely because the national survival of a country like mine is the primordial consideration at the moment. So that's what I observe, especially in my country, the Philippines. Yeah.
Speak of that, U.S. allies. I know Australia is trying to purchase emergency oil and gas from the gas from the United States. So, Robert, is that a choice, for countries like Japan, South Korea to purchase more oil and gas from the U.S.?
Well, the problem with that, and Donald Trump has been promoting this idea recently too, right? That sort of the United States is oil self-sufficient. The problem I would argue with that, I mean, we'll see if they can pull it off, is that the world is sort of a global market now for oil, right? There's a global price because when you have, I mean, yeah, you're already nodding your head, so I think you know where I'm going, right? Once you have sort of price differentials in one place to another, you get arbitrage, and so I think it will actually be really, really difficult for countries to sort of carve out their own niches. I think China has actually tried to do that in the past with sort of like one-to-one relations with the Gulf. I'm not sure how well that's worked out, but I don't believe that a lot of the democracies in East Asia have done that. So I'm actually rather skeptical of that. My own guess is for the future, and I don't know if we're going to get to this tonight, is that what you're going to see in Japan, South Korea, and elsewhere is a turn towards renewables, a turn towards energy, towards nuclear, coal, and things like that. I think that's probably the medium term where this is going to go because this shock was so swift and it was so rapid that I think there'll be some of the short-term measures that you're talking about, but I think probably by the end of the year you're going to start to hear people talk about nuclear again and sort of like clean coal and things like that.
Well, Zhao Hai, you mentioned about the short-term, long-term. Of course, we don't know how long the closure of the Strait of Hormuz will continue, will drag on, but at least 2 or 3 weeks. Based on remarks by President Trump, and he also said that those countries who depend on the oil out of this region, France, China, Japan. Do it by yourself. Take it. 90% of the Japanese oil is from this region. It is open. When the war is over, Strait of Hormuz will naturally open. Is that the case?
Well, we still don't know. I mean, first of all, if the Strait of Hormuz is closed, no other country can fill the vacuum, fill the blank. Basically, even if the United States is saying that we can exempt for 30 days Russian and Iranian oil that is already on the way, it's still not going to solve the problem because, again, the oil and the gas out of the Strait of Hormuz is about 20% of the demands. The global consumption. And also, and if we added other methods, for instance, the pipeline that is going out through the Red Sea and also across the peninsula outside of the Strait of Hormuz, is still having about 8% of the gap that cannot be filled. So the price will go up and the demand will go down because of the demand collapse. On the other hand, we all know that because of the price and because Europe, Asia, everybody is trying to pursue the rest of the surplus. Then we will have a reshuffling, reorientation of supply. Basically, United States and Russia and other countries cannot pump up more oil than they already have because the future, as we said, we don't know where the future is. We don't know where is the future price level, and therefore producers cannot actually ramp up their production to the maximum because they fear that once they get there, and in a short run, the price will collapse. They will suffer a loss instead of gaining the price difference. So again, I think we're facing a very chaotic market right now. There's going up and going down, and everybody is trying to spend more money to get the extra buffer for their own consumption. However, at the end of the day, I think Asia suffered the most because, particularly Southeast Asia, because they cannot afford higher price of oil and gas. They cannot actually fight with Japan, South Korea, or Europe because they can pay more. So at the end of the day, I think we have to wait for the end of the conflict, and we wish to end this conflict as soon as possible to stabilize the market. Otherwise, this thing again, we're facing a cliff. Just 2-3 weeks, a month down the road, every country is having a limited reserve. For example, helium is about 3 or 4 months, and for Japan, their oil reserves about 3 months. For South Korea, is probably shorter, and Southeast Asia has already run out of their reserves. So I don't think anybody else can actually fill the tanks of those countries, and we're facing a very dramatic rise of oil price in the coming months if this war does not end by the end of this month.
So you are predicting even worse situation in the upcoming, like in April or early May. I mean, that will affect.
Absolutely. Again. Yeah, I think there's a problem with the current futures market and current price, because if you go to the Middle East and if you want oil, the oil price is $160, $170 per barrel. It's not, if you look at the current future market, it's only 110.
10,
So
right.
there's a huge gap between the reality and the market. And the reason is that because the market has a price adjustment mechanism that is being depressed by the US government, by the Japanese government, that is trying to control the expectation of the oil price, not the real oil price.
Yeah, that is the issue. So, Anna, you earlier mentioned about this is a modern energy economies, even geopolitical. I mean, speak of that, I know that Manila has talked to the Chinese side about the possible resumption of exploration, of joint development of the disputed areas. How is the prospect?
Actually, this is a very important, in as far as my country is concerned, and as far as energy security is concerned of the Philippines. This possibility, a potential oil and gas exploration in the South China Sea is very important for us as far as the Philippines is concerned. Precisely because this will, to a certain extent, if this happens, it will give us a little of security when you talk about supply of gas and oil. However, in terms of prospect, that is also very problematic because Marcos Jr. government is saying that it's open to to this kind of possible joint venture with China. On the other hand, it also sending a mixed signals in a way that recently there was a pronouncement coming from Marcos Jr. as president naming certain parts of the South China Sea and as part of its sovereignty claim in the area. So I think the timing is not right. I think the Marcos government, if it wants to have a serious conversation with Beijing, when you talk about oil and gas exploration and possible joint venture in the future, which is very much needed by the Philippines, it should set aside sovereignty issue over the disputed waters of the South China Sea, set it aside, focus more on what you call low politics, and that's basically joint cooperation economically. It's very important for the Philippines really to shift the mind from geopolitics in the South China Sea to more economic and to more security in terms of energy and oil. So I think bottom line wise is Manila is sending mixed signals to Beijing. But as far as Filipinos is concerned, we're very happy to hear that there's this potential oil and gas exploration in the south, over the South China Sea, precisely because this is not new. There was an MOU or mutual understanding during the presidency of Duterte and between, President Duterte and Chinese President Xi Jinping. So I hope that this will push through. But of course, one thing that you have to remember, the influence of the United States is very strong. And now there are oppositions. The armed forces is saying that Beijing is not a reliable partner. Of course, there are pro-US Filipinos who are saying, we cannot do this with Beijing. But as far as I'm concerned, this is a good opportunity for us.
But challenging there. Robert, of course. Yeah, regional governments can try to diversify away a little bit, at least from the Middle East, if you look at the future options. Or, as you said, renewables. More probably adoption to renewables. Tell us more on that. How promising is that?
Sure. Well, I think, there are a couple things. Right now, so we were talking about this before with sort of Korea's current options. So Korea does actually sit on a great deal of coal, and the government has released reduce some of the environmental restrictions on that. That has direct air pollution effects, by the way, which you can feel at the moment, actually. Pollutants have gone up in Korea recently, and it's almost certain because of coal burning. South Korea also has a really good nuclear power industry. There's also a nuclear weapons debate in South Korea, in part because of that, which we've discussed on this show and other times. But the South Koreans actually export nuclear power facilities around the world. I believe to Dubai is one of the places recently. And so there's a lot of room for that too, right? That creates an obvious problem with nuclear waste and stuff like that, but we've seen this in other countries. I think there are actually options for that here. And then, of course, South Korea is really good at sort of modern high-tech stuff, right? You can see, for example, on bus stops here in South Korea where they have sort of the time for the bus to come, and it's powered by solar panels on top of the bus stop. So that for the first, we don't even have the United States. It was actually really clever. And so there's a lot of stuff like that here, right? I don't know about hydro. I don't have the sense that there are a lot of sort of big crashing rivers in Korea, but I think there's a great deal of sort of room. Offshore wind, right? Korea's 3/4 surrounded by water, 3 sides surrounded by water on 3 sides. So and I think that South Korean government has sort of supported this for a while, right? In part because they're aware that they're very vulnerable to these kinds of cutoffs. So I would imagine, again, if this thing goes on for like a month or two, which I think we're all kind of assuming, I would imagine by the end of the year you're going to see a major push by the Koreans to move towards renewables and nuclear.
Zhao Hai, do you also see a future, basically Asian countries will shift more and more to renewables?
Oh, absolutely. I think in the short run, we're scrambling for emergency measures to fill the gap. Strategic reserves and burning coal, and even trying to find kick up some of the renewable usage. However, I think in the long run, everybody starts to think, how do we resolve the energy independent problem? Countries need to diversify. That's number one. And number two, the sources of oil and gas. And number two, they need to diversify in terms of sources of energy. Other than carbon-based, they have to transfer towards more sustainable energy, including hydro, solar and wind, and particularly nuclear. I think everybody needs to look at a nuclear option because that's more consistent, stable, and also has a better sort of future in the short run to supplement the sustainable other source of energy. And one other thing is that I think after this, people also need to think about how to establish more peaceful world, to establish a peace structure in the Middle East, so that they need to make sure that the future energy supply from the Middle East that we still need can be sustainable, and the Strait of Hormuz can be maintained open for long term and not being disrupted. And the other option, of course, other than different energy sources, is that we need to have a global structure that looks into the potential energy disruption and to actually diffuse the new technology that save energy, that can help other countries to find and using new technologies to self-sustain. So there are many things countries need to look at after this war. Again, what I said, short-term, long-term. In the long term, I think many countries need to start planning now.
Well, long term, we need to start planning now. But also, it has a lot to do with when the war will conclude. Robert, do you have any idea when the war will be ending?
I would imagine within 2 months, because I do not believe that Donald Trump is going to take the risk of invading Iran. I don't think that the president can win without going in on the ground. 72% of the country in the most recent polling opposes an invasion. Donald Trump's approval rating is 35%. If he goes in on the ground and it turns into a quagmire, if it ends up becoming like Iraq or Vietnam, then Trump's approval rating will crash even worse. The Democrats get elected in the fall, and then he'll be investigated next year. I think there are major political ramifications from a failure on this. And so my guess is Trump will bomb for a couple more months, declare victory, and then exit, and then he will basically throw the Strait of Hormuz mess at the international community and say, good luck. That would be in Trump's character, right? I mean, so I would be surprised if this thing continues beyond 2 or 3 months, again, if only because of the election coming up, which will be very difficult for Trump's party.
Right. Well, Anna, okay, if Trump finished his job, let's say his job with a quotation mark anyway, so the Strait of Hormuz will be in the hands of the Iranians, and they have the law of managing or regulating the Strait of Hormuz. So that's a new normal?
Well, I think, and as far as Iran's right, and in terms of sovereignty of Iran and even clout of Iran in that area, I think it's a new normal. And now, as you can see, really, Iran has an upper hand in this Middle East war and even in controlling the Strait of Hormuz. So if that would be the case, then what can we do? It's a new normal, probably countries has to accept. And I think Iran would push that, that they will get an upper hand when it comes to negotiation, when it comes what they want, and in terms of their security as a country and their survival as a country. So for me, I don't have any problem with it if that's the case. Well, but of course the United States and its allies, even the European allies, would have a problem with that. But it has something to, we have to face this kind of reality. But I think other countries will definitely understand Iran if that would be the case.
Right.
After this war. Hopefully this war will be over soon.
I mean, if the U.S. with the most powerful military can't change that, I don't think any other countries or coalition of powers will do something or to change that. It's just a mission impossible. Well, on that note, we are coming to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Xu Qinduo, thanks for being with us. See you next time.